What if everything you think you know about why candidates accept job offers is wrong? What if the gut feel you rely on to make effective hiring decisions was biased in ways you've never even considered? The growing field of behavioural science reveals counterintuitive truths about human motivation that offers employers who understand it a powerful advantage in today's talent landscape. Keep listening and be prepared to challenge your assumptions about how people really make decisions. Support for this podcast comes from Indeed. They're a brand that I'm sure you all know as the hiring and matching platform where employers can connect with over 580 million job seeker profiles. But did you also know that their front row seat to the global economy gives them a massive data set which you can access for free? This allows you to see the latest information on job postings, salary trends, and much more. Or did you know that Indeed's new AI tools make it easier than ever for you to find and connect with active and passive job seekers? There's much more to Indeed. Visit Indeed.com.
There's been more of scientific discovery, more of technical advancement and material progress in your lifetime and mine than in all the ages of history.
Hi there, welcome to episode 697 of Recruiting Future with me, Matt Alder. Understanding human behaviour in recruiting is far more complex than it appears on the surface. Employers often misinterpret what truly motivates candidates to accept positions. At the same time, recruiters and hiring managers remain unaware of how their own unconscious biases are influencing their decisions. Traditional approaches built on assumptions rather than evidence leave organisations vulnerable to poor hiring outcomes and missed opportunities with ideal candidates. So, how can talent acquisition professionals leverage behavioural science to gain a meaningful advantage in understanding and influencing human behaviour throughout the recruiting process? My guest this week is Dominic Ridley-Moy, founder of the Behaviour Change Network. Dominic is a genuine expert in applying behavioural science to real-world business challenges. He brings specialised insight into how our brains make decisions and explains how behavioural science offers employers substantial advantages in creating recruiting processes that align with how people actually think and behave. Hi, Dominic, and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me on, Matt.
Absolute pleasure to have you on the show. Could you just introduce yourself and tell everyone what you do?
So my name is Dominic Ridley-Moy, and I run the Behaviour Change Network, which is all about bringing behaviour change theory to life and essentially helping people make better choices.
Fantastic. Now, I was really excited to have you on the show because behavioural science is kind of coming up more and more in day-to-day conversations in our industry. And I've had a couple of people come on and talk about it, but I wanted to talk to a genuine expert who does this for a living. Give us a little bit of context. Tell us, what is behavioural science and how does it actually get applied to, real world problems, business problems, those kind of things?
So just to bring it to life, I'm going to start off with a quick anecdote from Rory Sutherland, who often talks about what behavioural science is and brings it to life really eloquently. So if you don't know him, he's the vice chairman of the advertising agency Ogilvy, and he set up their behavioural science division and often talks about the power of behavioural science, especially his book Alchemy, which is a great read. And one of the examples that really brings it to life for me is around Red Bull. So Red Bull is one of those drinks that when it came out, it broke all the conventional rules of marketing. It tasted strange. When people tried it, when they did focus groups on it, a lot of the people came back and said they didn't really like it. It wasn't very nice to drink. It was expensive compared to other soft drinks, and it was much smaller. So it didn't follow the normal logical rules and rational rules of business marketing, but it worked. And that's because, and what you'll often find with behavioural science, it's about those counterintuitive solutions to problems that we face every day and getting to the bottom of what is the behaviour that you're actually trying to change and being clear about what affects human behaviour.
Absolutely. Tell us a little bit about the work you do, because you do some really interesting work in the public sector and beyond. How are you sort of applying behavioural science in practice yourself?
I do a lot of work with organisations, thinking about how can you get to the bottom of a problem. So a lot of the time it's thinking about what's an organisational challenge. And I do a lot in the field of social goods. So things like climate change, recycling, lots about looking at organisations and their products and services and thinking about how can you work out what a very specific problem is and how can you turn it into better services and better communications. So there's a lot on things like climate change, for instance. So if we want people to be more climate conscious, whether that's as a consumer or in an organisation, it's thinking about what are those very specific behaviours we want people to do differently. And with a lot of the climate actions, it might be switching your energy supplier. It's about what are the things that motivate you to make that change. And often it's things like when you move house, you're much more likely to change energy supplier. It's about cost. It's about ease. It's not necessarily about saving the planet. And sometimes that's the thing that makes the least difference when we're talking about getting people to take action.
No, absolutely. I remember we've known each other for a while. I remember talking to you about food recycling, and actually what drives people to do that was sometimes a lot more around convenience than the notion of saving the planet.
Exactly. And that's the thing, that a lot of the time people don't necessarily think that convenience and ease and those environmental barriers, that's the biggest driver of what people will do or not do, but we don't often start with that, particularly people working in communications roles.
And you kind of identify those sort of very specific and sometimes counterintuitive behaviours. What's the next stage from that? What do you advise people to do with that information? So
I think there's a first step where it's kind of thinking about, well, what is it that drives human behaviour? What is it that is making that difference? So looking at things like, so something like 80% of our decisions are driven by emotions. Sometimes we use the logical or rational part of our brain, and other times we use the automatic part of our brain. And other times we're doing things like a habit will kick in. So that's when our kind of brain stops fully participating in a decision-making process. And then we have all these kind of biases, which is really important in the field of human resources. So thinking about what are those kind of mental shortcuts we use on a day-to-day basis, which lead to conscious and unconscious biases. So being aware of all those things that drive human behaviour is probably one of the most important things you can do. Think about what is the problem you want to solve. Why aren't people doing what you want them to do? What are those barriers? And what's the next thing you can do?
So I kind of sort of asked you in advance to have a think about how this might work in a talent acquisition perspective. What do you think? What have you found? Where do you think behavioural science could be and behavioural change could best be applied in the world of talent and recruitment?
So when it comes to talent and recruitment, I think one of the things that everyone needs to be aware of in the industry is very much thinking about biases. And biases they affect how we make decisions and what we do. And I think the problem is that people don't always necessarily look at biases in the correct way. So a bias is basically, it's one of those shortcuts that we have in our brains. So as humans, we often make fast, efficient decisions based on past experience, based on mental shortcuts. So we make something like 35,000 decisions in a day. And to tackle that, we use these kind of shortcuts, these cognitive bias, unconscious biases, all those kinds of things that help us get by in a day. So looking at the root cause of these biases can be really, really powerful, especially when you're talking about unconscious bias and the social stereotypes that people hold and how that feeds into the recruitment process and means that we make decisions that aren't always the best ones to make.
One of the areas that I think is really interesting is when it comes to, recruiters selecting candidates and all those that kind of area. Obviously, a lot of people have a lot of experience at doing it, and they talk about they kind of using their gut feel to say who's going to fit. And, that to me seems like an obvious an obvious place for the kind of bias that you're talking about. But on the converse side, I think, we read lots of business advice that says, go with your gut feel because it's all your experience distilled and it's the right thing to do. Where do you stand on that? What's going on there?
The problem with using your gut feel is that what you end up doing, and there's loads of evidence to back this up, is that you can end up making a poor decision because what's happening with unconscious bias is the automatic part of your brain is kicking in. So you don't know that you're making necessarily a decision that is a bad decision. So you're trying to make the right decision and you're trying to be objective, but it can backfire. So you have all these biases. So things like affinity bias is a typical one. So that's the bias that we gravitate towards people who are similar to us and share the same qualities. So as a hiring manager, people tend to be much more likely to hire someone from the same school or grow up in the same city, same ethnic background as them, all those kinds of things. And then there's loads of other biases as well. So gender bias being a particular one as well. And although we think we're not being biased, if we're relying on our gut feel and the automatic part of our brain, it's something that we do without even thinking about it, potentially.
Yeah, exactly. There's no sort of filter between what is a not very useful bias and actually, what someone sort of applying their experience and things like that. The other thing about cognitive bias that I've noticed is obviously talent acquisition is being massively disrupted or potentially will be massively disrupted by AI and automation, a kind of a set of changes that we've not really seen on this kind of scale since the internet in the early 90s. And when people are discussing those kind of changes, I sort of see a lot of bias in the way that people think about the future. So lots of kind of status quo bias, wanting things to stay the way they are. The other one I read about was anchoring bias, where people go with the first thing that they hear about something. And, I think it's kind of really holding people back as we sort of try to imagine what the future looks like. How do you agree? Do those kind of biases apply? And how could people get around them to actually plan properly for the future?
Yeah, definitely. And I think you make a good point, because one of the issues with AI is that what you can get back from AI in particular can be quite biased because of the data that's in there. So if it's skewed towards the Western world, for instance, and that's where it pulls most of its data, there's those inherent biases already in lots of the AI models. So that's something to be aware of. But in terms of overcoming these biases and thinking about what you can do to tackle it, there's a number of different things. And it's the same, I think, for a lot of behaviour change problems and looking at the wider picture. So there's lots of things you can do, I suppose, starting at looking at how people make choices. And if we think about the talent acquisition and recruitment process, it's just thinking tips like things like just being aware of the problem, being aware that these biases exist, looking at other factors that may be influencing people's decisions, looking at the past, being curious, having a really open growth mindset, that kind of thing. And also looking at different perspectives. So a lot of the time we seek out views that reinforce our existing perspectives, particularly with confirmation bias is a really common bias. So what we'll do is we'll look for information that supports our existing beliefs. So being aware of that can make a big difference, but that's just the tip of the iceberg.
Sort of setting bias to one side just for a second, one of the other big aspects of recruitment and behavioural change is that obviously we're trying to persuade people to move jobs and persuade them that actually the opportunity that we're talking about to them is better than what they're doing already. And obviously, sometimes people can stay in jobs for years doing the same kind of thing. So it's a kind of a behavioural change thing. I don't know if I'm pushing that too far. How can this work in terms of sort of, persuading people, helping to move people into new opportunities, those kind of things?
So I think that's a really interesting example and a great one to focus on from a behaviour change perspective. Because actually, a lot of the time it's working out what the very specific problem is. So that kind of thing where actually people who move to your company thinking about what is that user journey and using personas and things like that but actually working out what drew them to apply for a job at your company or organisation, because a lot of the time it'll be very different from what you think or what you believe. And sometimes there's those counterintuitive solutions to these problems. So there's lots of examples that where if you're trying to attract a certain type of candidate, rather than waiting for them to come to you, proactively approaching people can make a big difference. So that's a simple change that you can make as an organisation. But just thinking about what's that experience like? If you want to attract certain people, when they have that first interaction with your company, when they go to your webpage, what do they see? What's that user experience like? Is it hard to navigate your website? Is it hard to apply for a job? What's the language you use in a job application form? All those kinds of things that people don't necessarily look at in great detail, but those first impressions are so important, and we don't always give them the attention they need.
Yeah, and I suppose the bit about uncovering people's true motivation is kind of is almost the cheat code for this, isn't it? Because as you say, very often it's not what people think it is. It's just kind of struck me that I know lots of employers will do surveys and ask people and all those kind of things, and maybe they don't always get to the kind of the real truth behind it. Is there a trick to do that? How do you really get to the bottom of what someone's motivation is for doing something?
So I think if you want to understand what motivates people, there's lots of different frameworks out there that are really helpful to get to the bottom of what motivates people. And it's different in different contexts. And a lot of the time it can be about thinking about what values people hold, things like that, but also looking at kind of what motivates people and also the context in which you're making a decision. So if you're using a kind of emotional part of your brain versus the rational part of the brain, all those kinds of things, there's lots of things that affect how we make decisions and why we make them. And those factors aren't always thought through as much as they could be. So if you want to uncover the real reasons about why people move jobs, it's really important not just to have a tick box exercise. Really think about what it is that informs why people take action, and the reasons can be multiple. So having some sort of survey will be useful, but actually having loads of data sources, so focus groups, just speaking to people, doing different things and really getting to the bottom of what the problem is and finding out why people made the decision they made can be really, really important. And just looking at all those different things. So a survey will tell you some things, but focus groups will unpick that even further and get into the bottom of, well, what was it that attracted you to this job? And always when I run focus groups, you get much more in-depth conversations, and there's always things that surprise you. So a lot of the time people just think, oh, well, the reason was X or the reason was Y. But when you look into it in a bit more detail, you find that actually what you thought was the case wasn't necessarily the thing that motivated people the most.
And I think that's an amazing point, because I think that's something that I don't think employers do very well. I think that people might ask, might have some kind of post-hire surveys, but I don't think they go into it in that level of detail. And there's obviously some incredibly valuable information particularly for sort of different types of roles and types of people that you're recruiting for that would really kind of inform, as you say, the whole marketing and the whole candidate experience around that as well. So obviously, lots of people listening, lots of people will have come across cognitive, unconscious biases before and all that sort of stuff. What's the practical way to do this? What sort of first steps do people need to take? And how much can people do themselves? And where would they benefit from working with an expert on this?
So I think the thing that makes the biggest difference, so there's definitely things that people can do themselves. And for me, it's working out what is the problem and what are the barriers that prevent people from doing what you want them to do. So if it's in terms of something like recruitment, it's really thinking about what steps people make in the decision that you want them to do. And I think the benefit of having an expert is working out what will work and what won't work. So thinking about those counterintuitive solutions and how can you shortcut that and make those decisions much more quickly? so that you get to a solution which is much more effective. So there's this great example from MIT where they had a problem with their mechanical engineering department. There were a lack of female members of the faculty. And what they wanted to do was to recruit more women to the department. And it was one of those interventions that requires multiple interventions. It wasn't just about doing one thing. And that's where having an expert is really, really important. So what they did was they tried to recruit to new positions, tried to increase the number of women that were in the department. But what caused a big issue was that they made the recruitment process even worse, because what they did was when they put job adverts out, they recruited to a very specific subfield of mechanical engineering. So that narrowed the potential field of female applicants even further and exacerbated the problem. So initially what they did was make one small change. They focused, instead of focus on subspecialities in their recruitment, they looked at a wider pool of candidates focusing on research, which meant that it was open to many more female candidates. And then they did a number of other changes as well. So before they'd just put a job advert out and hope for the best. But then they looked at female candidates who were proactively approached. So they went to people rather than just hoping for the best. Previous applications were revisited. And also the dean personally reviewed each application from a woman. So this was really, really important because it was looking at multiple different things, multiple points, not just focusing on one behaviour. And for me, that's one of the things that's really, really important. And as you'd expect, you ended up with more women joining the faculty. And as is always the case, there's unintended consequences to this intervention. So what happened was you had more female undergraduates choosing to take engineering because there were more female members of staff at the faculty.
That makes sense. And I think that you make a really important point there, that I think sometimes, this is particularly true in our industry, there can be a tendency to find what looks like the perfect simple solution to a problem, so kind of one aspect of behavior or one bias or whatever, and then just use that as the tool. But as you say, these things are multifaceted and there's lots of things going on, multiple interventions. So it's a lot more complex than people think it is, isn't it?
Yeah, that's definitely the case. And I think that's one of the biggest mistakes that people can make. It's thinking about whether you're going to try and do something where you just focus on one behavior and think, well, actually, that's going to make a bit of a difference. But actually, a lot of the time, it's really looking about the kind of culture of your organisation or something else, or multiple problems. And you just need to be clear on what it is you're trying to achieve and whether one or two simple solutions will solve it, or if it's a bigger problem where multiple interventions will work best. Absolutely.
And a final question for you. Kind of a bit about the future, a bit about technology. I mean, what do you think the future looks like? Do you think that you mentioned, some of the risks with AI? Do you think technology play a big part in this moving forward? What are you excited about? What are you worried about?
Yeah, definitely. I think from a behavioural science point of view, it's really thinking about how behavioural science works with other solutions, because behavioural science can help with certain things, but there's lots of other disciplines that will make that big difference. So how does behavioural science work with technology? How does it work with sociology? How does it work with economics? How does that all come together to make society a better place and to help people make better choices? And I think technology is going to have a really, really big part to play. I already use AI a lot, and it's something that I think will be really, really useful. So for me, it's to help me do that research more quickly, to help structure my thinking. So I think that's going to be really, really exciting. But on the flip side, we just need to be wary of what we're getting from AI. So obviously there's an issue with factual accuracy, but where those biases creep in as well. So how biased is the data? Where is it pulling its sources from? And just be mindful of that.
Dominic, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you for having me. Really enjoyed it.
My thanks to Dominic. You can follow this podcast on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can search all the past episodes at recruitingfuture.com. On that site, you can also subscribe to our weekly newsletter, Recruiting Future Feast, and get the inside track on everything that's coming up on the show. Thanks very much for listening. I'll be back next time, and I hope you'll join me.
This is my show.